The wind scraped through the dead city like a living thing, howling through shattered towers and skeletal buildings. It carried the scent of rust, scorched metal, and decay, remnants of a world that had collapsed under its own weight. Ash clung to the air, turning every breath dry and bitter. Frank pulled his scarf higher over his nose, adjusting the strap of his pack as he moved through the ruins. He had learned long ago not to linger. The city was filled with echoes of the past, ghosts of things better left forgotten. But ghosts didn't feed a man. Scrap did. And so he searched. His boots crunched over broken glass and twisted metal as he navigated what had once been a marketplace. A rusted-out vending machine stood nearby, its front shattered, its contents long since stripped away. He kicked aside some debris, searching for anything worthwhile, wiring a piece of unspoiled plastic, maybe even a can of food wedged somewhere deep inside. Nothing. His stomach twisted with hunger, but he ignored it. Hunger was familiar. Hunger was constant. He had been surviving like this for too long to count the days. Since the fall, since the world burned, since everything humanity had built came crashing down. Now, the cities were just bones picked over by scavengers and whatever things lurked in the shadows. Frank had no home, no people, just the clothes on his back, the knife at his belt, and the promise of another day if he was smart enough to see the sunrise. The sound came from his left, a soft, deliberate rustle, too controlled to be the wind. Frank went still, his fingers curled around the hilt of his knife, every muscle tensing. He had been through this before. Bandits. Scavengers like him, but desperate enough to kill for what little he had. Silently, he turned the corner and stopped dead. She was crouched in the rubble, half hidden behind a collapsed support beam. At first glance, she almost looked human, but the details were all wrong. Her skin was a deep, rich green, smudged with dirt but still eerily smooth beneath the grime. Long black hair, tangled and unkempt, cascaded past her shoulders. Her limbs were too slender, her fingers too long. She was wearing what might have once been clothing, but was in tatters, barely hanging onto her frail frame. She was digging through a pile of discarded trash, her movements sluggish, unsteady. She was starving. The realization hit him hard. He had seen hunger before. Hell, he had felt it every day, but this was different. Her arms shook as she tried to lift a torn food wrapper to her lips, as if she could somehow suck whatever nutrients remained from the plastic. Frank exhaled slowly. Not a threat. Not yet. Still, when she noticed him, she froze. Her entire body went rigid, her sharp, golden eyes locking onto him with a look that was more animal than sentient. Not fear. Not quite. More like waiting. She didn't beg. She didn't speak. She just watched him, every muscle tense like she was deciding whether to fight or flee. Frank should have walked away. Should have kept moving. She wasn't his problem. He had nothing. Nothing to spare, nothing to waste. And yet, before he even realized what he was doing, he reached into his pack. His fingers brushed against the last piece of stale bread he had. He hesitated. It wasn't enough to save her. Hell, it wasn't even enough to fill his own stomach. He should have kept it. He needed to keep it. But something about the way she looked at him, so rigid, so unwilling to show weakness even as her body betrayed her, made him move. Slowly, he pulled out the bread and stepped closer. She tensed further, eyes darting between his hand and his face. "Here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. No reaction. The hunger was there. He could see it in her, but something else held her back. Wariness? Distrust? Like she thought this was a trap. Frank exhaled through his nose, lowering his stance slightly, making himself just a fraction less threatening. "Take it," he said, quieter this time. "I don't have all day." A long, tense moment passed. Then, finally she moved. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the bread, cool and delicate, but not weak. There was strength in her grip, even now. Something passed between them at the touch. Something small, unspoken, recognition, not of each other exactly, but of what they were. Two survivors, two creatures who had nothing, taking whatever scraps the world gave them. She didn't thank him. She just tore off a small piece and ate it, chewing slow, measured like she didn't want to waste even a single crumb. Frank took a step back, watching as she ate, waiting for something. He didn't know what. A word? A sign of trust? Instead, when she finished, she simply looked at him again and stayed, not moving, not running, just watching, as if she didn't know what to do now, as if she didn't understand why he had helped her at all. Frank wasn't sure he understood either, but he did know one thing. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The woman didn't move. She stood there, still as stone, watching him like she was waiting for the trick, the trap, the moment when he'd snatch the food back and show his true colors. Frank had seen that look before, on people who had been used one too many times, who had learned the hard way that kindness always came with a price. But he wasn't expecting anything, and the longer she stood there, the more he realized she had no idea what to do with that. The wind picked up, cutting through the ruined city in sharp gusts. The sun was already sinking, dragging long shadows across the rubble. Night came fast in the wasteland, and with it the cold. Frank adjusted the strap of his pack and exhaled through his nose. He shouldn't care. He shouldn't give a damn about whether or not she made it through the night. She wasn't his responsibility. And yet, he heard himself speak before he could stop himself. "Come with me." Her body tensed even further, a silent refusal flashing in her golden eyes. Frank sighed. "Look, you don't have to trust me. Hell, I wouldn't trust me. But it's getting dark, and I don't think you're in any shape to be out here alone." He nodded toward the distance. "About a place. It's not much, but it's warm." She didn't answer, just kept staring at him, like she was trying to peel him apart layer by layer, looking for whatever game he was playing. Frank shrugged. "Do whatever you want." He turned and started walking, forcing himself not to check if she was following. He'd made the offer. That was more than enough. By the time he reached the edge of his shelter, the last light of day had vanished. The night air had settled into a sharp, biting chill. He pulled aside the metal sheet that served as his door and ducked inside. The space was small, wedged between the ruins of two collapsed buildings. Scrap metal, salvaged wood, and thick layers of fabric had been patched together to form a makeshift home. A single barrel in the corner held the remnants of a fire, its embers still glowing faintly. Not much, but better than freezing to death outside. Frank dropped his pack and crouched by the fire, feeding it a few scraps of dry wood. The flames flickered back to life, casting warm, dancing light across the walls. A faint rustle made him glance toward the entrance. She was there, standing just beyond the threshold, tense and unmoving. Frank didn't say anything. He just turned back to the fire, tending to it like he hadn't noticed her hesitation. After a few moments, she finally stepped inside. She didn't sit, didn't move closer. She pressed herself against the farthest wall, shoulders rigid, like an animal forced into a corner. Frank exhaled, shaking his head. "You act like I'm going to bite you." She didn't respond. Fine. He wasn't about to waste his breath, trying to convince her she was safe. Instead, he grabbed a worn-out blanket from the pile in the corner and tossed it in her direction. It landed at her feet in a crumpled heap. She flinched. Frank narrowed his eyes. Whatever had happened to her before, it had taught her to expect the worst. He stretched out his legs, leaned back against the wall, and closed his eyes. "Get some sleep," he muttered. "Or don't. Just don't stare at me all night. It's creepy." Silence. Then, after a long moment, the sound of slow, cautious movement. Fabric shifting. Frank cracked an eye open just enough to see her hesitantly pull the blanket around her shoulders. She didn't lie down, didn't relax, but she didn't throw it aside either. That was something. He let his eyes drift shut again. His body ached from the day's scavenging, and exhaustion was already pulling him under. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was her golden eyes, still watching him, filled with something unreadable. Sometime in the night, he woke to a sound. Soft, faint. His instincts kicked in immediately. His hand went to the knife at his side as he pushed himself upright, his heart pounding. Then he realized she was the one making the noise. She was trembling. Even in sleep, her body was tense, curled in on itself, her fingers clutching the edges of the blanket like it was the only thing keeping her together. Her breath came in uneven gasps, her brows drawn tight. Frank exhaled through his nose. She was having a nightmare. He had two choices. Wake her, let her deal with it herself. Or he reached for the second blanket beside him and, without a word, draped it over her. She didn't stir, but after a few moments, the shaking eased. Her breathing evened out. Frank leaned back against the wall, rubbing a hand over his face. What the hell was he doing? He had spent years learning not to care, not to get involved. Survival was simple when you only had to look out for yourself. But now, there was someone else in his space, taking up room in his thoughts. He didn't like it, didn't trust it, but for some damn reason, he had offered her shelter. And for some damn reason, she had stayed. Frank woke to the soft crackling of dying embers and the distant whistle of wind slipping through the gaps in the scrap metal walls. The air had turned cold overnight, the kind of chill that sank into your bones if you didn't keep moving. For a moment, he lay still, blinking at the faint glow of the fire, disoriented. Then, memory crept back in. The alien woman. She was still here. Slowly, he turned his head. She sat against the farthest wall, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. She wasn't asleep, but she wasn't quite awake either. Her golden eyes, reflecting the firelight, were half-lidded, distant. A quiet stillness surrounded her, like she was somewhere else entirely. She must have sensed him stirring because her gaze snapped to him, sharp and alert, the lingering haze vanishing in an instant. She was always like that, watchful, ready to react. Frank pushed himself up, wincing as the stiffness in his muscles protested. "You get any sleep?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. She didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, she gave a small nod. "A lie, probably." Frank sighed and rubbed a hand down his face. "Yeah, me neither." Silence settled between them again. It wasn't quite uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. He still didn't know what to make of her. She had stayed, which was unexpected, but she hadn't exactly warmed up to him. He wasn't sure why he cared. Pushing the thought aside, he turned his attention to the fire, tossing in a few scraps of wood to coax the flames back to life. The warmth spread slowly, filling the small space with flickering orange light. His stomach twisted, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten much yesterday. Frank reached into his pack, pulling out the last of his food supply, 2 small strips of dried meat and half a stale protein bar. Not much, definitely not enough for 2 people. He hesitated, then glanced at her. She was still watching him, her gaze flicking to the food in his hands before quickly shifting away, like she didn't want to be caught looking. Frank let out a slow breath. He was going to regret this. Wordlessly, he tore the protein bar in half and held out a piece to her. Her eyes narrowed. Suspicious. "Relax," he muttered. "Not poisoned." Still, she didn't take it. Frank rolled his eyes. "Look, if I wanted to kill you, I wouldn't waste food doing it." That, at least, seemed to amuse her. The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. Finally, she reached out and took the food, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second. It wasn't much, but it was the first time she had accepted something from him without hesitation. Progress. They ate in silence. After finishing his meal, Frank stood and stretched, rolling his sore shoulders. "I've got to check the perimeter. Make sure nothing's been sniffing around." She tilted her head slightly, but said nothing. Frank grabbed his knife and moved toward the entrance. Before he stepped out, he glanced back at her. "You coming, or are you just going to sit there all day?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the invitation. He wasn't sure why he'd said it. Maybe because he was getting tired of being watched like some unpredictable animal. Maybe because she needed to see how things worked out here if she was planning to stick around. After a few seconds, she stood, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders before following him outside. The city ruins stretched endlessly in every direction, gray and lifeless beneath the pale morning light. The wind carried the faint scent of metal and dust, the remnants of a world long gone. Frank scanned the area, his instincts sharp as he checked for anything out of place. He had learned the hard way that complacency got people killed. She lingered a few steps behind him, her movements quiet, calculated. "Stay close," he warned. "You see anything that looks off, you tell me." "Got it." A nod. Frank wasn't sure if she'd actually listen, but it was better than nothing. They walked in silence, weaving through the wreckage of old buildings, picking through whatever scraps might be useful. Frank had gotten good at spotting value in junk, loose wiring, intact containers, anything that could be repurposed. He was focused on prying a metal panel loose from a collapsed vending machine when he heard her voice. "You fix things?" Frank paused, glancing over his shoulder. It was the first time she had spoken more than a single word to him. He wiped a bit of grime off his hands and shrugged. "Yeah, when you live out here long enough, you learn to patch up what you can." She studied him for a moment, then reached in her belt and pulled something out. A knife, or at least what used to be one. The blade was chipped and dull, the handle cracked down the center. She hesitated, then held it out to him. Frank took it, turning it over in his hands. "Damn, this thing's seen better days." She said nothing, just watched him with quiet expectation. He sighed, tucking it into his belt. "I'll see what I can do." It wasn't a promise, but it was something. As they made their way back to the shelter, Frank noticed something strange. She was helping. Without a word, she had started picking up small pieces of salvage, bits of wiring, metal scraps, things he would have grabbed himself. She never asked what he needed, never waited for instructions. She just did it. Frank wasn't sure how to feel about that. By the time they returned, she had collected a small handful of useful materials. She set them down near the fire without a word. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You always this quiet?" She glanced at him, considering. Then finally, "Rely." Frank blinked. "What?" She hesitated again, as if uncertain whether she should continue. Then, with a slow inhale, she met his gaze. "My name," she said. "Rely." Frank stared at her for a second. Then, to his own surprise, he huffed a quiet laugh. "Well, took you long enough." She tilted her head slightly, almost amused. Frank leaned back against the wall, folding his arms. "Frank." Rely nodded once. For the first time since he'd met her, she didn't look ready to run. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, wasn't tense. It just was. And for now, that was enough. The fire had burned low, its glow barely illuminating the walls of the shelter. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the ruins like a restless ghost. The night had settled into an eerie quiet, the kind Frank had learned to respect. It was the kind of silence that usually meant something was waiting, watching. But tonight, the only sound inside the shelter was breathing. Relay's breaths were uneven, shallow. Frank had noticed it earlier in the day, the way she moved just a little slower than usual, the way she barely touched the food he gave her. At first, he thought she was just being careful, still wary of accepting anything from him. But by midday, he caught the slight tremor in her hands, the way she swayed on her feet when she thought he wasn't looking. Now, she was curled against the wall, shivering despite the blankets wrapped tightly around her. Sweat clung to her skin, dark strands of hair sticking to her face. Even in sleep, her expression was tight, like she was bracing herself for something unseen. Frank sat beside the fire, running a hand down his face. He had seen sickness before. Hell, he'd felt it before. Malnutrition, dehydration, fever. It was a death sentence out here if he didn't have the strength to push through it. And Rely? She was barely holding on. With a sigh, he reached for the small container of water he had left. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He shifted closer and placed a hand on her shoulder, shaking her lightly. "Hey, wake up." Her body tensed immediately. It was instinctive. The sharp inhale, the way her fingers twitched as if reaching for a weapon. But when her golden eyes flickered open, they were unfocused, distant. She wasn't fully here. Frank held up the water. "You need to drink." She blinked at him, sluggish, as if trying to process his words. "Rely," he said, firmer this time. "Come on." For a moment, he wasn't sure she understood. But then, slowly, she shifted, pushing herself up with effort. He could feel the heat radiating off her skin. She was burning up. She reached for the water with shaking hands. Frank steadied her grip without thinking. Her fingers curled around his, surprisingly cold despite the fever. She flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. She drank in slow, controlled sips, like she had learned to ration water down to the last drop. Frank watched her, his jaw tightening. She was too weak, too damn stubborn to say it out loud, but he could see it in the way she moved, how much effort it took just to sit upright. When she finished, she let out a slow breath and leaned back against the wall. Her body trembled as she tried to gather herself. Frank knew that look, the one that said, "I don't want to owe you anything." "You're sick," he said simply. She didn't respond. "You need to rest. Actually rest." Her gaze flickered toward him, hazy but sharp enough to carry a warning. "I'll be fine." Frank scoffed. "Yeah, you're real convincing." She shifted, wincing slightly as she adjusted the blanket around her. "I've had worse." That much, he believed, but that didn't mean he was about to let her drop dead in the middle of his shelter. "Just shut up and sleep," he muttered. "I'll keep the fire going." She hesitated, like she wanted to argue, like she wasn't used to anyone telling her to rest. Then, finally, she let her head tilt back against the wall, eyes slipping shut. Frank stayed where he was, watching the flames flicker. He didn't know why he cared, why he had bothered. She wasn't his problem. And yet here he was. She woke in the dead of night. Frank had dozed off against the wall, his knife still in his hand, his body still half alert even in sleep. Years of surviving alone had made sure of that. A rustling sound pulled him back to consciousness. He opened his eyes to see Relay shifting restlessly, her breathing uneven, her face tight with something he couldn't name. A nightmare. Frank exhaled. He had plenty of those himself. Then she whispered something. At first, he thought she was speaking to him, but the words were too faint, too raw. A name. Someone she had lost. Frank frowned. He didn't know what made him do it. Maybe it was the way she looked, vulnerable in a way she never allowed herself to be while awake. Maybe it was something else. Either way, he reached out, hesitating only for a second before pressing a hand to hers. Her fingers twitched. Then, slowly they stilled. The tension in her body eased just slightly. Frank let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. For the first time since they met, she didn't feel like a stranger. For the first time, she looked like someone who needed someone else. Frank didn't say anything, didn't move. He just sat there, her hand resting lightly against his, and watched the fire until morning. The fire burned low, its glow barely holding back the darkness that pressed against the shelter. The wind outside was restless, slipping through the cracks in the metal walls, carrying the distant sounds of the ruined world beyond. But inside, there was a different kind of quiet, a fragile, uneasy silence that had nothing to do with the night. Frank could feel it, hanging in the air between them like an unspoken truth, something neither of them wanted to name. Relay sat by the fire, legs tucked beneath her, her golden eyes focused on the flickering flames. She looked better than she had a few days ago. The fever had finally broken, and some of the strength had returned to her limbs. But she was still thinner than she should be, and he noticed how she moved carefully, as if testing the limits of her own body. She wasn't just healing. She was waiting. For what? Frank didn't know. Maybe for him to ask. Maybe for him to finally push to demand what he hadn't before. But he didn't. Instead, he picked up a small chunk of metal he had scavenged earlier, turning it over in his hands. "I can probably sharpen this into a decent blade," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Might not hold an edge long, but better than nothing." Relay's gaze flicked to him. "You fix things," she said, the words soft but certain. Frank snorted. "Only when they're worth fixing." Silence stretched between them again. She didn't look away this time. Then, before he could stop himself, before he could think better of it, he asked, "Who left you behind?" Relay's fingers tensed against the fabric of the blanket draped over her shoulders. She didn't answer at first. He almost regretted asking. Almost. Then, finally she exhaled. "My crew." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something she was holding back. "We came here on a mission. I was the only one who survived." Frank frowned. "Survived what?" She hesitated. Then, without looking at him, she said, "The betrayal." His chest tightened. He knew what that felt like, what it meant to be cast aside, to be left for dead. But there was something in the way she said it, something that made it different. "How long?" he asked. Relay turned her gaze back to the fire. "I stopped counting." Frank exhaled through his nose. He had spent years surviving in these ruins, but at least that had been his choice. For her, it hadn't been. So what was the mission? Her jaw tightened. She shook her head. It doesn't matter anymore. Frank studied her for a moment. The way her hands curled slightly into fists, the way her shoulders tensed like she was bracing for a fight that wasn't coming. She was lying. Or at least, she wasn't telling the whole truth. But he let it go. For now. Later that night, he caught her watching him again. She wasn't trying to be subtle about it this time. Frank leaned back against the wall, letting out a slow breath. You're staring. You stare too. He smirked. Yeah, but I'm subtle about it. That almost got a smile out of her. Almost. Instead, she shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. You're different from them. Frank raised an eyebrow. Them. Humans. He huffed. That's supposed to be a compliment. She tilted her head slightly, considering. I don't know yet. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Fair enough. The fire crackled between them. Then, before he could stop himself, before he could think about why he was doing it, he reached out. It wasn't much. Just the briefest brush of his fingers against hers where they rested against the floor. Rely stiffened. For a moment, he thought she would pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she exhaled, slow and careful, like she was testing the weight of the moment. Frank swallowed. His throat felt dry. This a bad idea? He asked, his voice quieter than before. Rely didn't answer right away. Her fingers twitched against his, as if she was still deciding. Then, slowly, she turned her hand, letting her palm press lightly against his. Her skin was cool, even after sitting by the fire. Frank let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. And then, before he could stop himself, before he could convince himself that it was stupid, that it was dangerous, he leaned in. Not much, just close enough that he could feel her breath against his skin. Rely didn't move away, didn't flinch, didn't stop him. Instead, she met him halfway. Her lips were soft against his, hesitant but firm. Not desperate, not rushed. Just there, a moment that neither of them should have wanted but had been waiting for anyway. Frank's fingers tightened slightly around hers, grounding himself in the warmth of her touch. When they finally pulled apart, she didn't let go. Neither did he, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. Frank wasn't sure what changed after that night. It wasn't as if things between them had suddenly become different. They didn't talk about it. There were no whispered confessions, no long explanations. But something had shifted, something unspoken but undeniable. Rely still kept her quiet, careful ways, still observed him with that same unreadable intensity. But now, there was something softer beneath it. The sharp edges weren't quite as rigid. And Frank, he didn't pull away anymore. They settled into a new rhythm. Rely started helping without needing to be asked, gathering supplies when they scavenged, patching up small gaps in the shelter, making sure the fire didn't burn out when he was gone. She moved through his space like she belonged there. And for the first time, he didn't mind. One evening, Frank sat by the fire, sharpening a piece of scrap metal into something resembling a usable blade. Rely sat across from him, methodically weaving strips of salvaged cloth into rope. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that no longer needed to be filled. But then she spoke. You don't have to leave. Frank's hands paused for just a second before resuming their steady work. He didn't look up. What do you mean? She kept her gaze on the rope in her hands, fingers moving with quiet precision. You talk like you're just waiting for the next place, like you're always ready to leave. Frank exhaled, setting the blade down. That's how you survive out here. You don't get attached to things that won't last. She was silent for a moment. Then, I want to stay. Frank looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't asking. She was choosing. The words settled between them, heavier than they should have been. She had been left behind before. She had lost things, lost people. And yet, here she was saying she wanted to stay. With him. Frank swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure what he could say that wouldn't make this moment feel smaller than it was. So instead, he reached out. She didn't flinch when his fingers brushed against hers. Didn't pull away when he laced them together, testing the weight of it, the reality of it. She just held on. A choice. A promise. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Frank let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, not everything had to end. The sun hung low in the sky, a dull red or barely cutting through the hazy air. The ruins stretched endlessly in every direction, broken bones of a dead civilization. Frank and Rely moved through the wreckage carefully, their steps practiced and quiet. It was another scavenging run, another search for something, anything they could use. But Frank felt it in his gut. They were running out of time. Food was low. Water was even lower. The shelter, patched together from scrap metal and fabric, wouldn't last through another storm. They needed to leave. But where? Rely didn't ask, but he knew she was thinking the same thing. She had chosen to stay with him. And now, for the first time since he met her, he felt the weight of that choice. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was waiting for him to find a way out. They had just finished clearing a collapsed storefront when Frank heard it, the unmistakable hum of an engine. He froze. Rely was already moving, pressing herself against the remains of a rusted-out vehicle, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. The sound grew closer, a low, steady rumble. Not the erratic sputter of a scavenger's ride, but something controlled. Organized. Frank's jaw tightened. Patrol. A dark shape emerged from the distance. A large, reinforced transport vehicle, its tires kicking up clouds of dust as it cut through the ruins. The faded insignia on its side was unfamiliar, but the design was clear. It belonged to a colony. Frank's muscles tensed. He had spent years avoiding places like this. He knew what colonies meant: rules, control, people who thought they had the right to decide who was worth saving and who wasn't. He had walked away from one before, and now one had come to him. The vehicle rolled to a stop just a dozen yards away. The doors hissed open, and 4 figures stepped out, armed. Their weapons weren't raised, but they were held at the ready, a silent warning. The leader was a broad-shouldered man with short-cropped hair and a tactical vest. His sharp eyes swept over them both before settling on Frank. "You're a long way from shelter," the man said. Frank didn't answer. The leader's gaze flicked to Rely. His stance shifted slightly, subtle, but Frank caught it. He wasn't just wary. He was assessing her. And Frank knew what that meant. She wasn't human. He could already see the calculations running through the man's mind. An alien, stranded in the wasteland, surviving alongside a human. Was she dangerous? Was she valuable? Did she belong? Frank's fingers twitched toward his knife, but Rely stepped forward first. "We're just passing through," she said, her voice calm but firm. The leader studied her for a long moment. Then, he glanced at one of his companions, a woman wearing a patch with a faded symbol on her shoulder. She nodded slightly. Frank didn't like that. They were communicating, making a decision about them. Finally, the leader exhaled and lowered his weapon. "There's a settlement not far from here. Safe. Structured. Better than dying out here." Frank's jaw tightened. "And what's the cost?" The leader smirked slightly, as if he respected the bluntness. "You work. You contribute. No freeloaders." His eyes flicked to Rely again. "And she's going to have to prove she's not a threat." Frank felt something cold settle in his chest. Of course, it wasn't enough that she had survived, that she had fought just as hard as any human. She was different, and people never liked different. Frank exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Every instinct told him to walk away, to keep moving, to keep surviving on his own terms. But he wasn't alone anymore. His eyes drifted past the patrol, scanning the ruins that had been his home for too many years. Vera, 7. Once, it had been a thriving world, a place where humans and aliens worked, traded, built a future together. Now it was nothing but a carcass, stripped bare by war and greed. The air was still tainted with the ghosts of orbital strikes. The streets whispered with the echoes of a past that had burned itself to the ground. He had spent years pretending it didn't bother him, that it was just another dead world in a universe full of them. But the truth was Vera, 7, had shaped him, hardened him. It had made him believe that survival was the only thing that mattered. And now, he had a chance to leave it behind. He looked at Rely. She wasn't staring at the patrol. She was staring at the horizon, at the wreckage of the place where she had been abandoned. Frank understood that look, the weight of knowing that no one had ever come back for her. She had survived this world, just like he had. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to anymore. He turned back to the patrol leader. "You got room for two?" The man nodded. "If you can pull your weight." Frank glanced at Rely again. She didn't flinch, didn't question. She just stepped forward, matching his stride. And together, they followed the patrol toward whatever future awaited them. The air was different here. Crisp, clean, no longer thick with the choking scent of rust and decay. No longer weighed down by the ever-present tension of survival. For the first time in years, Frank wasn't waking up to the sound of wind howling through crumbling ruins or the distant, ominous echo of something lurking in the shadows. Instead, he woke to warmth, to the quiet hum of life beyond the walls, to the faint scent of fresh earth and morning air filtering through the open window, to the steady, comforting weight of her. Rely. She was still asleep, curled against him, her dark hair spilling over his arm. The soft glow of early sunlight painted golden streaks across her green skin, making her look almost unreal. Frank had spent years sleeping with one eye open, always on edge, always ready for the next fight. But here, in this moment, wrapped in the quiet peace of their shared space, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long, long time. Safe. He exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on her waist, pulling her closer. She made a soft noise in her sleep, shifting slightly, pressing into the warmth of his chest. He still wasn't sure how they had ended up here. Months ago, they had been starving in the ruins, watching each other like they were waiting for the inevitable betrayal. Now they had a place, a home, a life beyond just surviving. The colony had taken them in, cautiously at first, with suspicion hanging heavy in the air. Rely had been tested, observed, forced to prove herself in ways no human ever had to. But she had done it, with quiet determination, with a strength that never wavered. And Frank, for the first time in his life, he had chosen to stay. The morning stretched lazily around them, golden sunlight filtering through the curtains. Rely stirred, her breathing shifting as wakefulness crept in. Frank felt it in the way her fingers curled slightly against his chest, the way her body tensed before relaxing again. Then, slowly, her eyes opened. She blinked up at him, golden irises still hazy with sleep. Frank smirked. "Morning." She made a soft sound, more a breath than a word, before nuzzling closer. "Too early." He chuckled, letting his hand trace slow, idle patterns along her back. "You say that every morning, and you never let me sleep." His grin widened. "I could let you sleep." He slid his fingers lower, tracing the curve of her hip. "But you always seem to have other ideas." Rely hummed, tilting her face up slightly, her lips brushing against his jaw. "Liar." Frank's breath hitched at the contact, the warmth of her skin against his sending a slow, steady ache through his body. Months ago, he never would have imagined this. Never would have thought he'd wake up wanting someone like this. Not just for the heat of her body against his, not just for the way she fit so perfectly against him, but for everything, for the quiet moments, the laughter, the nights spent whispering in the dark, trading stories, trading trust. He cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing over her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes half-lidded, her breath warm against his lips. Then, without hesitation, she kissed him. It was slow at first, unhurried. A lingering press of lips, a gentle exploration. But then she sighed into it, her fingers sliding up his chest, and just like that, everything changed. The kiss deepened, heat rising between them in a way that was both familiar and new all at once. Frank rolled her onto her back, settling between her legs, his hands roaming over smooth skin, tracing the curves and lines of her body. Rely arched into him, her breath hitching, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pulled him down. This wasn't desperate, wasn't rushed. This was theirs, a slow, consuming need that had been building for months, shaped by trust, by choice, by something deeper than either of them had expected. And when he whispered her name against her skin, when she gasped his in return, it wasn't just about passion. It was about belonging. They had survived the ruins. They had built something more. And now, in the warmth of the morning light, in the safety of their home, they let themselves live.